Today about this exhibition and the catalog that went with it. The exhibition has just closed in New York about 10 days ago, and I am very much missing having all of these beautiful paintings in the museum with me. The exhibition, you see a glimpse on the screen now of the poster and for the exhibition that gave a mysterious, kind of tantalizing partial view of one of Sargent's most famous paintings, and it is the painting that inspired the entire exhibition. That is his painting today known as Madame X, a portrait of an American-born socialite named Virginie Gautreau. And this is a painting that Sargent made in 1883, 1884, but about 30 years later, looking back at his career, he would call this painting the best thing he had ever done. And so in the exhibition and the catalog, we really wanted to put this painting into the context of Sargent's career at this early, remarkable moment when he is living in Paris. And this painting is, some have said, a kind of Mona Lisa of the Metropolitan Museum's collection. So it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of foreground this work and dive deep into its significance in Sargent's career. You see the painting here on Sargent's easel in his Paris studio around 1885, just as he was about to leave Paris. And that is the image that greeted our visitors when they arrived at the exhibition, announcing the focal point of the exhibition in these very, very bold graphic design. But the exhibition really focuses on just one decade of Sargent's remarkable career, and that is from his arrival in Paris in 1874 as an 18-year-old art student. You see a photo of him at 18 years old there on the left of your screen, still a very, very young man. And the exhibition covers that next decade of his career until about 1885, just after he painted Madame X and is getting ready to leave Paris and settle in London for the rest of his life. And I think you can see from the photo on the right compared to the one on the left, how much he personally grows up, matures, and transforms in this decade. And the same is very much true of his art. Some of the major themes of the exhibition, which are also addressed in the catalog, which Tony showed you. I liked how you made the gold on the cover sparkle when you twisted it. We look at Sargent's early artistic training. He arrives in Paris very well prepared to finish his artistic training, and we see him honing his skills in drawing, studying from the live model, and experimenting with painting. He is very, very interested in art history and looks to the great paintings and great art of the past. I'm showing you here two examples of copies that Sargent made after the old masters. On the left, his copy after the great Spanish painter Velázquez, and on the right, a painting after Frans Hals, a huge portrait by Frans Hals. And we'll talk more about these paintings later today. Travel was a theme that was incredibly important to Sargent during his time in Paris. He was constantly moving throughout Europe, looking for subjects to paint that he could exhibit in Paris, hoping to find subjects that would appeal to sophisticated audiences in Paris. And this is a theme that is explored in an essay in the catalog. We also look closely at Sargent's friendships and relationships with the women in Paris. Sargent connects to a group of very intelligent, artistic, women who are at the center of French cultural and artistic life. And this really helps him further his career and establish relationships that help him very much in Paris. Of course, his work as a portraitist is probably one of the best known aspects of his career. And it is in Paris, in this first decade of his career, that he really creates remarkable, bold portraits that push the boundaries of convention and establish his reputation in the French capital. But before I dive into the exhibition deeply, by way of introduction, I wanted to give a little bit of background about Sargent's childhood and early life. You see here on the left a photograph of John Singer Sargent with his sister Emily around 1867. Sargent would have been 11 years old. His sister was 10 years old. And on the right, a portrait of his mother, photograph portrait of his mother, Mary Newbold Sargent, who was a tremendous presence in his life. John Singer Sargent is born in Florence, Italy in 1856 to American parents. They are from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from the Boston, Massachusetts area, and they moved to Europe intending to stay for just a short time, but end up living there for the rest of their lives. So Sargent is raised in Europe. His family moves constantly with the seasons. They're always looking for affordable lodging and healthy climates for members of the family who were sick and had some issues. And Mary Newbold Sargent, as you see on the right, was herself an amateur artist who liked to draw and paint in watercolor, and she encouraged all of her children to sketch constantly. She also loved to sightsee and explore. According to her family, they said she was never happier than when she was heading to or away from the train station, always ready to start a new adventure. And as the family traveled, she made sure that her children visited every museum, every important monument, every picturesque site across Europe. And Sargent grew up sketching, studying the world around him, and practicing his skills from a very early age. And I show you now two watercolors by Sargent. They're not in the exhibition, but these are from the Metropolitan Museum's collection. And he did these watercolors when he was 14 years old. Remarkably practiced, remarkably observant of the world around him, and already very accomplished for a teenager. You see him practicing portraiture on almost a genre scene of these local people in the Swiss Alps, or a very picturesque landscape on the left. And Sargent would paint in watercolor throughout his life. But now I wanted to really make the point that Sargent was very, very accomplished, very cosmopolitan by the time he arrives in Paris. And that takes us to the first section of the exhibition that focuses on his time in the studio in Paris as he's honing his skills and beginning his career. And this is, as you come around the corner and enter the exhibition, this is the view that you would encounter, which shows some of his earliest works, but then also down this long hallway, a very remarkable and important travel picture that he does in Morocco. So we're setting the scene for the range of his ability and interest in different subjects. But starting with this section, which really looks at the time of from his arrival in Paris and the work that he's doing to finish his artistic training. The earliest work in the exhibition is this drawing called The Dancing Faun, which Sargent made after an plaster cast of an ancient sculpture. He made this drawing in Florence, Italy, in the winter of 1873, 1874. So he would have been 17 or 18 years old. And this is just before he leaves Italy and settles in Paris. He does this at the Academy of Drawing in Florence. And again, I wanted to demonstrate that Sargent, at such a young age, already has so much skill. and is, again, very well prepared to embark on formal artistic training in Florence. Up until this point, his training was a bit ad hoc. He had some lessons from painter friends in Rome. He was being advised by artists that the family met as they traveled through Europe. But this time in Florence, before he goes to Paris, is just a time where he is really practicing his skills. And we know that the first thing that he does when he arrives in Paris with his family in the spring of 1874 is find a teacher. And we know that he arrives with this big portfolio and folder of drawings and sketches, which he then presents to his potential teacher, a French portraitist named Carolus Duran. And a drawing like this, The Dancing Faun, must have been one of the works in that portfolio to show his skill already. He is accepted into the studio of this teacher immediately, Carolus Duran, and becomes almost instantly one of his star pupils. After just a few years in Paris, we can see how much his skill as a draftsman improves and develops. And this comparison is a kind of before Paris, after Paris. The work on the right is done just a few years after arriving, where he has been studying drawing at the French Academy, the École des Beaux-Arts, and we see a development of his skills, a refinement of his technique, and this wonderful interest in light and shadow and creating relief, and a very, very beautiful and I think sensuous drawing. It's really in Paris, in the studio of Carolus Duran, that Sargent learns to paint in oil. I said he had been painting in watercolor before he arrives in Paris, but it's the oil practice that he learns. And his teacher, Carolus Duran, taught a technique that was considered progressive at the time. He taught his students to sketch with the paintbrush using a lot of pigment and a tonal technique. Sargent graduates to studying the live model, of course, in the French academic tradition. And these two early painted sketches of the same model show his developing technique, the expressive brushwork, especially on the work you see on the right, or his interest again in creating form with light and shadow. Um, I would just compare that sketch of the model to Sargent's interest in the old masters and how he was constantly looking at the great art of the past and the present to hone his technique, to inform his practice. In 1880, he will travel to the Netherlands and make a long trip studying the paintings of the great old master Frans Hals from the 17th century. And you see one of Sargent's copies there on the left. The way that he is looking at Hall's painting technique, his use of the brush to create, again, this very expressive evidence of his brushwork. Sargent is very much taking those lessons and applying them to the work that he does in the studio. Sargent, when he arrives in Paris in 1874, he finds a city that is very much transforming into the center of the European art world. Paris is coming out of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, 1871, a war that caused much destruction in the city. A new government is formed, and the city is reviving itself. And it is becoming increasingly cosmopolitan. Artists are flocking to the city to take advantage of all the opportunities there, just like Sargent. Interestingly, Sargent rarely paints modern life in Paris. He will focus on his portraiture. He will focus on traveling and exploring in Europe. But this example on the screen now is a view of the beautiful Luxembourg Gardens, the very famous park in Paris. And it really shows Sargent's knowledge of contemporary art in Paris. We know also that when he arrives in Paris in 1874, he has just missed the first exhibition of the group known as the Impressionists. But in 1876, he will visit the second exhibition of the Impressionists. He will become very friendly with one of their leaders, Claude Monet, and be really inspired by their practice and interests. And the painting of the Luxembourg Gardens that you see on the screen shows interest in the kind of subjects that the Impressionists are painting. The modern parks of Paris, the elegant couple, the flaneur strolling the streets, and of course, his interest in the transitory effects of light. And he is capturing this moment as the moon rises over the beautiful park, creating a very kind of sensitive rendering of the effect of dusk. And there is a very beautiful detail in this painting if you look at the moon on the right side and how he creates the reflection of the moon on that pond, scraping his paint palette knife, I think, across the surface to create this shimmering effect. After just 3 years in Paris, Sargent makes his professional debut as an artist by exhibiting this portrait at a massive annual exhibition known as the Paris Salon. This was at the time a state-sponsored exhibition held every spring. It would include 2,000 paintings, 2,500 paintings. Artists needed to submit their work to a jury and have their work accepted to be included. It was a huge social event every spring. We know in this period they could have upwards of 400,000 people visit this exhibition. So for Sargent, it was a tremendous opportunity to have his work seen by a larger public. The exhibition attracted critics who would write about the art, potentially publicizing his work, but also potential patrons who might then purchase his work or commission a portrait from him. For his debut at the Salon, he painted this portrait of a family friend, Francis Watts, um, in a very charming mode. He's very much inspired by the work of his teacher, Carolus Duran, to create a charming image of this young woman. He puts into the portrait an interesting gesture and pose, giving it a kind of liveliness that did capture the attention of critics. And in his debut at very competitive exhibition, he did get some write-ups in the newspaper that remarked that this new, young, upcoming artist named Sargent was capable of painting charming portraits, especially of young women. And this is just the beginning of his strategy to have his work seen in Paris that will really launch his career very, very quickly in the French capital. But in the next two sections of the exhibition, we looked at Sargent's time outside of the studio, and again, his interest in traveling beyond Paris and exploring. In 1876, when he was 20 years old, Sargent crossed the Atlantic Ocean for the first time to visit the United States. So even though he was born to American parents, he doesn't visit the United States until he's 20 years old. And in fact, once he moves to Paris in 1874 and stays there about 10 years, that's the longest he had lived anywhere to this point. So Sargent actually doesn't really have one place that he grew up. And I think in part for that reason, I mean, he always considered himself an American, even though he never really lives in the United States for any length of time. He always identified as an American. And I just show you here a couple of examples from his first crossing of the Atlantic. This painting, Atlantic Storm, from that trip shows him capturing this intensity of a storm. He is looking down the deck of the ship to the back and the wake of the ship in these huge, tremendous waves, creating a very, very dramatic composition. I think that a work like this is very much inspired by the art he's seeing around him in Paris. This is an example on the left by the French painter Gustave Courbet, who I think inspires Sargent in these kinds of dramatic seascapes. At the very same moment that Sargent paints Atlantic Storm, he also paints the work you see here on the left, Atlantic Sunset, two paintings of the same moment in a very, very different style. If as I suggest, Atlantic Storm on the right is inspired by a painter like Courbet, who was interested in capturing the drama of the sea, I think that Atlantic Sunset is probably inspired by the work of the Impressionists. And I'm showing you here on the right a work not in the exhibition by Claude Monet, his famous Impression Sunrise of 1873. Sargent, as I said, met Monet in 1876, right before he would have crossed the Atlantic and made that painting you see on the left. And I think, in effect, his interest in the shimmering effects on the water, again, capturing the effects in the clouds. I think you can see how he's inspired by the work of the Impressionists. And I like to make that comparison because I think it's very important to how Sargent is learning to paint in this period. In addition to having lessons from his teachers and enrolling at the academy in Paris, by looking at the art around him, experimenting in different styles, being inspired by these different artists, he is learning a lot, incorporating the lessons of the great art around him into his practice to make work that is entirely his own. This is another exhibition painting that Sargent made for the Paris Salon. This is from the next year, 1878. His debut was with the portrait of Fanny Watts, and the second year he exhibits in Paris, he shows this landscape painted on the coast of France at Brittany, a very typical subject for the period, an interest in rustic or rural labor. These women are headed to the shore to gather oysters, which was a very popular industry in this town. They're wearing very typical dress for the region. And subjects like this were very popular at the exhibitions in Paris. They're kind of nostalgic for a pre-industrial past at a time when the world in Europe is getting very, very modern and technical very quickly. Many artists, including Sargent, capture this kind of sense of nostalgia for the past. What Sargent does so well in this painting, which is based on many studies he makes in Brittany, is capture the sunlight, the effect of light in the clouds in that brilliant sky, and look particularly at the way he captures the reflection of light in the pools of water. This brilliant effect of light, which kind of unifies the whole composition. The As I said, the paint. We want to look at this one section for a minute because give us a little insight into Sargent's artistic process and how he makes his compositions. Here you can see two studies for the painting, really focused on that young boy that you see in the oil sketch on the left. Sargent made pencil studies first, then oil studies, building in the effect of light, honing details of costume, gesture, and pose before incorporating these sketches into the final composition. And just wanted to point out that these paintings may seem very natural and based in observation of real life, but they are also the result of many, many studies, careful compositions, and working hard to plan and create a harmonious composition. Sargent also visits Italy quite frequently throughout his life. And these are two examples from a summer that he spends in Capri, Italy, just off the coast of Italy in 1878. And we really see his interest in the exotic, the picturesque, capturing the local beauty, the local people. But I really wanted to underscore what we see is a developing interest in painting white and using white paint. And this is something that Sargent becomes known for and excels at. On the right, you see him doing a rather spontaneous study of the whitewashed architecture of Capri, where he is just trying to get the effect of light and shadow on these white walls and steps. It's a remarkably modern composition and a very spontaneous sketch. He is also, well, in Capri, he hires local models to pose for him and build compositions like the one you see on the left, which shows a young local model named Rosina Ferrara dancing on the rooftop in the shadow of Vesuvius as the sun sets and the moon rises. And again, Sargent's not only his interest in white, his interest in the exotic, but he has a lifelong interest in capturing the body in motion, in dance, in performance, and expressive gestures, which we will see again and again in his work. The next gallery of the exhibition, oops, sorry, I got ahead of myself. I apologize. The main exhibition picture from his time in Capri is this painting of a young woman posed in the olive trees of Capri. And that is that same model that we just saw, Rosina Ferrara. Again, Sargent focuses on an image that doesn't seem connected to the modern world. This woman was known as a local beauty. She posed for many, many artists and was really seen as representing the ideal exotic beauty of the people of Capri. And that is what Sargent is capturing here. The Capri was also known for its connections to antiquity and settlers who had come in the time of the Etruscans or even earlier. And Sargent's reference to the ancient olive tree, to the typical Capri costume and this exotic beauty are all really identifiable to viewers in Paris as this kind of beautiful, exotic, timeless image. Sargent travels further afield as he finishes his formal training in Paris. He is determined to spend time in Spain, where he studies the great Spanish painter Velázquez. He is determined to spend time in Venice, a city that he adores and will return to throughout his life. But during the winter of 1879, 1880, after visiting Spain, he travels to North Africa and Morocco, where he paints the work that you see on the center, which was that, as I said, one of the focal points of the exhibition. This is a painting known as Fumée d'Ambergris in French, or Smoke of Ambergris. This is, again, a painting inspired by his travels, but it is made in his Paris studio using a model. And we know that as he travels, often he is gathering material, collecting jewelry, textiles, artifacts from these regions, and then to use them later in his studio. So the painting is surely based on something he witnessed or saw, but then created back in his studio in Paris. The subject is mysterious and evocative. This woman is using an incense burner at her feet to perfume herself with this smoke of ambergris as she uses the veil over her head to capture the scent. People in Paris found the subject very mysterious. They thought maybe it was a religious ritual. It was not quite clear to them when they saw it. But when Sargent's friends asked him what this painting was about, he told them it's about the color. And for him, the aesthetic experience and demonstration of his ability to use the white paint with great control and technique to vary the colors, the tones, the different textures of the fabrics. And, we say it's a painting about white on white, but you see how much he varies the tones of white to the golden yellows, to the silver, the grays. It's very, very beautiful technique. I show you just one close-up detail of the incense burner at her feet to show you Sargent's attention to detail, his great technical skill, and point out how in his kind of control of using the white paint, he reserves the brightest white pigment just for these highlights. And look at the way he paints the edge of that incense burner with thick white pigment, really, really a beautiful, beautiful detail. And the way he creates the reflection of this silver burner. we really can see and admire his skill. Oops. This painting is another work that is shown at the Paris Salon to acclaim, to get great attention. And I show you here on the right a photograph of the Paris Salon exhibition. This is actually from the late 1860s to give you an idea of what it looked like to visit that exhibition. The paintings, as you can see, were hung like puzzle pieces, frame to frame, from floor to ceiling, crammed together. They were, in Sargent's time, they were arranged alphabetically by the artist's last name. So there was a huge variety of subjects, of styles, all shown together. And one of the things that Sargent figures out and learns very quickly is that for his paintings to get attention at this exhibition, he needs to create bold works. And the white on white of the Smoke of Ambergris painting is something that stands out. It's a larger painting. It competes visually in this very chaotic environment. Some of the many people who saw this painting at the Salon, um, there were some that actually commissioned Sargent for portraits based on seeing works like this. And in the next gallery of the exhibition, we look at Sargent's rising career as a portraitist. This woman, whose name was Amalia Subercaseaux, is one such patron who saw that Fumée d'Ambergris at the Salon and commissioned Sargent for a portrait. She was the wife, excuse me, she was the wife of a diplomat from South America. She had just arrived in Paris when she commissioned Sargent to paint this portrait of her. And Sargent shows her very much as the elegant, chic woman of Paris. She is shown in her living room of her home in Paris. And Sargent creates a vignette, very charming vignette, as if she has just paused in playing her piano and gazes at us. She is wearing a very elegant black and white dress and this beautiful interior, the bright blue carpet, the red and white flowers, and that beautiful planter, probably made of ceramics. All of these details really meant to demonstrate her taste, her elegance, as much as the painting is a display of Sargent's talent in Paris. Um, these portraits are collaborations between the artist and the sitter and are really, as I said, meant to not only display Sargent's talents for potential audiences in Paris, but also to position this woman as she wants to be seen in Paris society. Um, there that same year at the Salon, the exhibition, Sargent showed another portrait. So he showed the portrait of Madame Subercaseaux and a portrait of these two young children, 14-year-old Edouard Peyron and 10-year-old Marie-Louise Peyron. Um, Here he's really, I think, demonstrating kind of the range of his ability in portraiture. The work on the right, very, very flattering and elegant, just the way a young woman of Paris would want to be displayed. On the left, a kind of bolder example of his portraiture that really captures the intensity of these two young children. And there is a very funny story about the Salon exhibition this year. The wonderful thing for Sargent is that the painting on the right, the portrait of Madame Subercaseaux, wins him a medal. And this is a great honor and distinction for him. It means that from this point on, he will no longer have to submit his paintings to the jury to be admitted to the exhibition. And how the award happens is they actually had a medal and they would place it on the frame of the painting. So everyone who came to the exhibition could see that this was an award-winning portrait. But there was the father of these young children. Here you see him, Edward Peyron, whom Sargent had painted the year before, really objected to the medal going to the portrait of Madame Subercaseaux. His argument was that the medal should not go to a painting of a foreign-born woman when it could go to the painting of his French children. And we are told by Monsieur Supercazot that Mr. Pyron takes the medal off of the portrait of Madame Supercazot and puts it on the portrait of his children, causing quite an uproar at the exhibition. It is resolved and the medal is replaced, but it does speak to a moment of great nationalism in France and some beginnings of sentiment against foreigners who are infiltrating the capital in a very serious way. But Edward Pyron really becomes one of Sargent's most important early patrons. He commissions first the portrait of himself. He is a rising playwright in Paris, and Sargent portrays him very much the bohemian artist, his kind of untucked shirt. He's in a very casual pose, and you see him holding a dog-eared book, evidence of his profession. He was so pleased with the portrait that he then commissioned not only the portrait of his two children, but also a portrait of his wife. And all three of these portraits ultimately shown at the Paris exhibition, but also destined for their apartment in Paris. I would like to just say a few words again about the portrait of the two children. I think it's one of Sargent's very interesting portraits from this period because in a way it really defies our expectation for portraits of children in the period. Um, Normally, we would see children looking very sweet and delicate, but here Sargent really knew these children well and paints a portrait that is quite intense. Um, the expressions, the gestures, the poses, the unusual composition were all very, very bold at the time. If we look closely at the portrait of the daughter, as I said, she was 10 years old, we see kind of the intensity of her expression and her gaze, the way she stares at us. Notice the position of her hands and the tension of the gesture, the clenched the clenched hand and fist, or her other hand, which seems to be pushing off of this bench. She grew up and wrote her memoirs and talked about what it was like to pose for Sargent. She tells us that although she found Sargent very, very charming and fun and youthful and engaging, once she had to pose for him, she really did not like the process. She claims that Sargent made her pose 83 times for this portrait, which is an extraordinary number and really challenged the patience and attention of this young child. She also tells us that she and Sargent fought over how she should wear her hair, her dress, her costume. Sargent wanted to control every element, and this young girl wanted to assert her independence. But I think you can see her aggravation in that clenched fist and very, very intense gaze. If we compare it very briefly back to the portrait, the painting of the ambergris, and just think about how Sargent paints white, these lessons that he is taking from his travels and his interest in painting white, all of these things go into his work in the studio as well, and this great technical ability with paint. A very, all of these practices are informing each other. Um, One of the things that critics start to say about Sargent's paintings in this period is that they have the ability to capture your attention when you pass by them. And I think that's such an interesting comment because Sargent, as I said, really is needs to capture attention at this massive exhibition. This is an important quality for his work, that they will compete on the very, very crowded walls of the exhibitions to make people notice them. And that bright white of her dress, the intensity of her gaze are all details that help his works get attention. And I just show you a very fun photograph of the portrait in the family apartment. Because even though we talk about these and how Sargent builds his career by exhibiting them, ultimately they are made for people's homes. And you can see, I hope, at the center, there is the portrait of the children hanging in the apartment. And if you look on the right, in the reflection on the mirror, you can actually see the portrait of their mother as well. And just to notice how in this very decorated, crowded apartment, that painting really does grab your attention and pop off the walls. One of Sargent's, I think, most remarkable portraits of this period is this portrait known as Dr. Pozzi at Home. Dr. Pozzi was a friend of Sargent's. He was a good friend of Sargent's teacher, Carolus Duran. And Carolus Duran and Dr. Pozzi and Sargent were all members of the same social club in Paris around 1880. And that's probably how they met. Sargent found this doctor very charismatic, very handsome, and creates a quite unusual and provocative portrait of him. Dr. Pozzi was at this time becoming a very famous surgeon in Paris with a very strong reputation. He was a pioneer in the field of women's health. In the field of gynecology, he's known as the father of gynecology. He wrote a very important treatise on the subject, which is used in France for many, many years. He was very, very well respected as a surgeon. But Sargent is not painting him as a surgeon. He's doing something very bold. He is showing Dr. Pozzi at home in his dressing gown, his robe, and his slippers. He's creating a much more private portrait of this professional figure. Dr. Pozzi was also an art collector, an aesthete, and he moved in very progressive artistic circles in Paris. And that is how Sargent is painting him. Remarkably bold painting of him in red, these kind of beautiful long hands and a very dramatic gesture as if he's on a stage in this very lush red velvet interior, which we believe was Dr. Pozzi's home. Dr. Pozzi was known, as I said, a very charming figure, very handsome figure in Paris. Sargent found him brilliant and charismatic. And you can just compare the photograph to the painting to see how Sargent not only captures the likeness, but really makes him very elegant and graceful. The Sargent's really inspired by the old masters, as we've said. And I think that he's also looking to the art of the past again. And the red costume of Dr. Pozzi really calls to mind old master portraits of popes or royalty, red being a very important color for the church, the Catholic Church, and for royalty. And Sargent really creates a kind of regal and bold image of Dr. Pozzi. It's one thing that's very interesting about this portrait is that Sargent did not exhibit it in Paris. And I think that's because he knew it would have been a bit scandalous to create this very sensuous, seductive portrait and where Pozzi would have been recognized. It would have been considered shocking. So instead, Sargent exhibits the painting in London and in Belgium, where people did not know Dr. Pozzi. And he does get a lot of commentary on this painting. Art critics call it very bold, very flashy, a little too stylish, but they have a lot to say about it. One of Sargent's, I think, greatest portraits is the work that we showed in the next gallery, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyt. And I think this is such a highlight of his career. In the exhibition, we really created a moment and gave it a lot of space so people could spend time with this very large portrait. It is a painting of the four daughters of Edward Darley Boyt and his wife, Louisa. The Boyt family were very good friends of Sargent's in Paris. They are from the United States as well. Edward Darley Boyt, the father, was himself studying to become a painter, so he and Sargent shared this interest in art and progressive painting. And Sargent creates a really compelling portrait of his four children. They are in their Paris apartment. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about this work of art is the way that it kind of blends elements of portraiture with genre painting, or as a scene of everyday life. Sargent is interested in creating portraits, but he's maybe more interested in arranging an unusual composition, in building the space studying the architecture through his use of light and creating a very kind of complex composition where the light is coming from the left side, casting light, bright light and shadow across the surfaces, across the costumes of the four young girls, but then creating this very mysterious sense of space in the background where you kind of can't quite make out the space and the light just sort of gives shape and presence to it, where we see a mantelpiece, a mirror over the mantle, the reflection of the window. It's a complex space which Sargent has constructed very carefully. Pardon me. I think one of the things that's also interesting is the use of scale. Sargent shows the two daughters at center leaning against this very large Japanese 19th century vase. And creates an uncanny sense of scale. Many people have compared it to the great novel Alice in Wonderland, where, if you know that story, Alice, the young girl Alice, is sometimes very small and very big. And here we get that sense of, why is the vase so big? Why is the scale of the girls, the children, it kind of makes them look smaller and dwarf them. I think there's a very interesting quality to that in the painting. If you look closely at the girl leaning against the vase, you also see that Sargent barely painted her face. She's almost in a shadow. And that was very confusing to visitors as well. Is this a portrait? Why didn't he show the daughter's face? There are so many beautiful details in this painting. Look at the way he paints the young girl on the left in bright light, creating shadows, the intensity of the reflection on her pinafore, the creation of the folds, the use of his paint. You see him becoming a very, very skillful painter. And I show you here just a detail of the fourth daughter, where I hope you can see even more clearly how Sargent's brushwork is becoming very abstract, almost very, very fluid. But there are amazing and very, very compelling individual details in this painting that show what a great painter he's becoming, even as the whole is such a strong and modern composition. We showed this painting in a gallery with only one other painting, and that is Sargent's copy after Velázquez of probably Velázquez's greatest painting, Las Meninas. Of course, Velázquez is working in Spain in I have a typo in there. That was actually painted um, in the 17th century. So I'm sorry, it's not 1879. It should be 1679. And Las Meninas is one of the Velázquez's greatest portraits. Itself a very unusual portrait for the period, where Velázquez was painting the princesses in a very unusual composition, including himself in it, using negative space reflection and kind of details that Sargent pulls out. And I wanted to make the point that Sargent is, again, really inspired by the art of the past. And when you see the two works side by side, I hope you start to see the lessons that Sargent is taking from Velázquez. He picks out individual details, like using the mirror in the background, creating a lot of negative space at the center of the composition. But then Sargent modernizes it and makes the painting really his own as well. As we move further into the exhibition, from that gallery, we have a view down this big corridor leading to the painting of Madame X. And for the next few galleries, the final galleries of the exhibition, we really focus on Sargent's work in portraiture leading up to Madame X. So the next gallery talks about Sargent's friendships and patronage in Paris, particularly with the women of Paris, as I mentioned earlier, these really remarkable women who are at the center of French cultural and artistic life. Sargent paints their portraits, builds an artistic network through charm, charisma, social acumen, and really establishes himself in Paris. He has developed a reputation as a flattering portraitist of women. And I'm showing you a few works that you've already seen in the exhibition, and at the center, another painting of a friend, Charlotte Burkhart. This is how Sargent builds his reputation in Paris, painting the women of Paris, creating flattering works of art. And this is a very popular trend at the time. And Sargent thinks very carefully about how to position his work in the art world of Paris. So we have a moment in the exhibition. We had a gallery devoted to works by other artists. So the next few works that I show you are by artists that Sargent knew or was inspired by. On this slide here, at the center, you see a great portrait by Sargent's teacher, Carolus Duran. This is a portrait of the artist's wife. This is a painting that really inspires Sargent. He's thinking a lot about all of these different types of representations of the women of Paris as he paints them himself. So on this slide, you see on the right a painting by Léon Bonnat, who was one of Sargent's teachers. At the center, as I said, Carolus Duran, Sargent's main teacher. And on the left, a work by Manet, who was an artist Sargent admired. Um, we have really created a view in the exhibition so that you can compare works by other artists, images of the women of Paris with Sargent's portrait of Madame X. We will talk more about Madame X in a minute, but one of the things that's often said about the portrait of Madame X at Center is that it is a very bold portrait. And in the exhibition and in the catalog, I really wanted to create a comparison so you could see how different Sargent's art is from what other artists of the time were doing. And here on the right is the portrait by Manet, and on the left is a portrait by the American expatriate painter James Whistler. And here is a close-up of some of these works. The portrait by Carolus Duran on the left, and the portrait by Léon Bonnat on the right. These are two of Sargent's teachers, as I said, working in very different styles, painting very different types of Parisians. And we can, again, just start to think about how Sargent's portrait of Madame X looks so different and is doing something very, very different. But as we enter the next gallery, really we'll focus on this portrait of Madame X, which I had introduced earlier. As I said, Sargent would eventually call this the best work he had ever done. And it occupies a very, very special place in his career. Sargent had had so much success in Paris so quickly. I think this created a lot of pressure on him to perform better every year, to create more sensational works of art, to make his painting bolder. And that is how this portrait comes to exist. Sargent is determined to create a masterpiece for the Paris Salon exhibition. He has been in Paris at this point for about 9 years, as I said, had so much success. He is very, very ambitious. This portrait is not a commission. Virginie Gautreau was famous in Paris for her beauty, for her appearance, the way she dressed herself, and Sargent found her particularly fascinating. He sought an introduction to her through a mutual friend and asked her to pose for him. So she agrees. She is someone who is interested in celebrity. She was often written about in the newspapers of the day. People read about her and followed her very, very closely. They wanted to know who she was with, where she was going, what she was wearing. And she knew that having her portrait painted by Sargent, a rising star in Paris, would bring more celebrity and fame to her. And Sargent knew that if he painted a portrait of this famous woman in Paris, that would bring more attention to his work. So it really is a collaboration of two young people in Paris who are ambitious, and seeking fame and attention. She, she's, as I mentioned, she is an American. She is born in the southern United States in New Orleans, Louisiana, to parents of French descent. So she is what we would call Creole. She has French heritage. She grows up in the United States speaking French. Her father dies fighting in the United States Civil War. And after his death, her mother takes her to Paris to raise her there. She is only 8 years old. She is a native French speaker. They have still a lot of family in Paris. So they go to Paris. She attends French schools, will marry into French society. But people in Paris will always consider her American and an outsider in Paris. They never fully accept her in Paris. When she gets married to a wealthy French businessman, she invents herself as this spectacular beauty with the kind of image you see here, relying on beautiful dresses, what was considered an elaborate and excessive amount of cosmetics, and a very artificial appearance. As I said, Sargent is fascinated by her unusual appearance and beauty and has convinced her to pose. When she agrees, they work together on the portrait for many, many months. Interestingly, Sargent thinks that he'll paint it very, very quickly and be finished with the portrait in 6 weeks. But that's not what happens. He works on this portrait very, very hard. He changes it frequently, he edits it, and it takes many, many more months for him to finish it. But when it is finished in the fall of 1883, Madame Gautreau writes to a mutual friend that says, she says, the portrait is finished and it is a masterpiece. We know that she loves the portrait. Um, Interestingly, when the portrait is exhibited in Paris, it will cause a great scandal. So I will show you now. This is I think, an interesting image and maybe a little shocking, a photo of Madame Gautreau from around the time she gets married. So this is before she kind of develops her signature appearance. But I find it such a fascinating comparison because I'm not sure um, it's easy to recognize her as the same person. So not only does she transform her appearance after her marriage, but also Sargent really emphasizes her glamour at this time. She Not only is she known for her beauty, but an important thing to know about her is that she is someone who really infiltrates Paris society, and it becomes very close to the center of French cultural and political life in Paris. And here on the right, you see a very interesting image. This appeared in a magazine, actually in Germany, in 1884, so just before this painting was shown in Paris. And Madame Gautreau is shown in kind of the background at the left. If you can see her maybe kind of in profile. She is at a party at the presidential palace, standing between the French president and the French prime minister. And we can see that she has really become also close to French political power. And the accompanying article here to this illustration talks about how easy it is, in a very kind of not nice way. It's very easy to get invited to these parties. Anyone can get invited. And you can see Madame Gautreau here, and the writer says she's only invited because she's so beautiful. And that is how she kind of infiltrates Paris society. And this is something that angers people in France. They see her as a real interloper in Paris. So when the portrait is shown in Paris in May 1884, there is a huge uproar about this painting. We know from some descriptions of the opening day of the exhibition that People gather around the painting and are whispering about the portrait, but primarily they are whispering about Madame Gautreau herself. They find her a scandalous person. They object to her appearance, her use of cosmetics that was really deemed excessive and artificial. She was known to cover all of her skin with a lavender tinted powder to enhance the paleness. She dyed her hair red with henna. She rouged her ears to make them look more red. And people found this very bizarre and unflattering and very artificial. There were also rumors about her reputation. Many people thought that she had bad morals. There were rumors that she had had marital affairs, and she has a very, very kind of scandalous reputation in Paris. And part of the criticism of this portrait is criticism of the sitter and her position in Paris society. Oh, I forgot to show this slide, which shows some of the many, many sketches that Sargent made in advance in preparation of the portrait. He makes more sketches in advance of this portrait than he does for any other portrait in his career. And you see him really kind of obsessed with capturing her beauty and in a many, many different poses. But one of a very important detail to know about this painting is that how we see it today is not how Sargent first painted it and exhibited it. A very famous detail is that when Sargent first showed the painting in Paris, he had the strap on her right shoulder falling off of her shoulder. This becomes a huge focal point of the criticism of the portrait. As I said, people thought that she had bad morals, that she was scandalous, and that fallen shoulder strap becomes a kind of symbol of her reputation. It's not just that the dress is very bare or low cut, it's that it was associated with the idea of undress, that she was taking off her clothes or her clothes were about to come off. And this really connected to her scandalous reputation. And there is just a lot of kind of very interesting commentary focusing on that strap. And in the exhibition, in the next gallery, we take a moment to kind of give more information about the Paris Salon, about what it was like to see art there, to compare the portrait of Madame X to other works that were shown that year. And so on the right of this image, this is a projection of paintings that were shown at the same exhibition that our visitors can kind of compare the portrait of Madame X in style, in pose, in gesture to other works that were seen there. We also show a number of illustrations from the period about the Salon exhibition and what it was like to attend. Here you see a print. This is from 1882, which gives you an idea of the huge number of people who attended these exhibitions. So when I say there was a big scandal, there are a lot of people going to these exhibitions and gossiping about the painting and going to see the works of art. But I also show here a few satirical cartoons of the painting from the period. So these images, these kind of funny, joking images, really speak to some elements of the scandal. On the left, you see a cartoon of Sargent at his easel making fun of the portrait of Madame Gautreau, because here she is shown dancing as a mermaid or a siren. In other words, a temptress, a woman who, again, referring to her morals. At center, the cartoon shows her as the Queen of Spades, um, like a playing card. Um, this is kind of remarking on her unusual pose, the flatness of Sargent's painting, and kind of mocking that. And for me, the one on the right is one of the most amusing and funny portraits where you see that the cartoon shows the strap really falling off, exposing her chest. And the comment underneath says, calls out to her, Amelie, it says, "You're losing your dress." And she responds, "It's on purpose. Leave me alone. This doesn't concern you." This speaks to her complicity, her involvement in creating the portrait. We know she was involved in all of the decisions on how the portrait should appear, choosing her favorite dress. She knew that Sargent would paint her like this, and this really speaks to her complicity in the portrait. Um, as this scandal goes, we know that Madame Gautreau's mother was very, very upset by what happened, and she actually begs Sargent to remove the portrait from the exhibition. She is embarrassed by the scandal, but in fact, she continues in the following years to constantly remind people of the portrait. And one of the ways she does that is by actually going out in public wearing the dress that is shown in the portrait. So people really think about the portrait a lot. Another thing that she does is she has her portrait painted several times again, but by other artists, and takes the opportunity to borrow signature details from Sargent's portrait in the later portrait. So you see in this portrait from 1891 by Gustave Courtois that she's also shown in profile with her very pale skin and her strap falling off her shoulder. And she'll do this several more times. Sargent is also not ruined by the scandal. He is very upset that the portrait is not well received, but he does defend it, as I said, saying it's the best thing he had ever done. He will, for the next 30 years, always keep the portrait in his studio nearby. And it actually becomes a very exciting thing to get invited to his studio to see the portrait. It always has pride of place in his studio. And he will kind of rebound quickly from this scandal. And that's the very last gallery of the exhibition addresses the kind of aftermath and what happens next in his career. And that is, he does move to London, England for the rest of his life. But he doesn't do that because of the scandal. He had been thinking of doing that even earlier. And in fact, he already had portrait commissions in England. This is one of the first portraits he does after he exhibits Madame X. This is a woman who becomes a very important patron and a dear friend, Mrs. Elbert Vickers. Um, Sargent will maintain his connection to Paris by exhibiting works of art there for the rest of his life. And this is the portrait that he will send to Paris in 1885, the year after this big scandal. And it will be very reassuring to audiences in Paris. They may be a bit afraid that Sargent will create shocking portraits if they commission him, but Sargent reassures them by creating this very elegant image of this young woman. Sargent continues to return to Paris and France throughout his life, and he writes to his friend Claude Monet, the great impressionist, that he doesn't want to be forgotten in Paris. So, in addition to exhibiting paintings there, he maintains his connections to his French artist friends. And in the mid 1880s, he really is experimenting with Impressionist painting outdoors. And here you see Sargent's casual portrait of Claude Monet painting at Giverny. So he shows the great Impressionist painter doing what he is known for, painting outdoors in the woods. And these relationships with the French artists will be very, very important to his career for the rest of his life. The exhibition ends with two works. First, this wonderful painting of a famous Spanish dancer known as Carmencita. Um, this was also a portrait that is not commissioned. Sargent saw her perform in Paris, was captivated by her, and asks her to pose, and creates this incredible, formidable portrait of this performer on a very large scale, painted very, very brilliantly, and exhibits it in Paris. And it has an important place in his career because it is purchased by the French government for the Louvre Museum. This is a real symbol of his acceptance in France, his popularity in France, and really secures his reputation in Paris, where he becomes an artist. But the final work in the exhibition, I wanted to show this self-portrait of Sargent from 1886. So this was painted when he was 30 years old. Almost all of the works that we have talked about today are painted before Sargent is 30 years old. It is a remarkable early career for him, where he finishes his training, becomes incredibly successful, and he's still very, very young. And this self-portrait itself is very modest, it's very humble, but when he paints this, he is just beginning the next chapter of his career. And at this time, there's a very well-known article written by the great American writer named Henry James, who kind of reflects on Sargent's career thus far. And he says something very interesting. He writes about Sargent, and he says his artwork shows the uncanny spectacle of a talent on the very threshold of its career with nothing left to learn. And he really points to Sargent's youth and skill, and he asks, what does the future hold for Sargent? And what the future holds for Sargent is that in the years after Paris, he will become known as one of the greatest contemporary portrait painters of all time in Europe and in the United States. He will go on to paint murals at institutions in Boston. And here's just 3 examples of his work from the next decade that really cement his reputation as one of the great artists of his era. But all of the seeds of these next chapters really begin in Paris. The skills he learns in Paris, the technique he learns in Paris, and importantly, all the relationships and friendships that he makes in Paris. And just to remind you, this exhibition will open in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay at the end of September. And it's interesting to note that Sargent has kind of been forgotten in Paris. So we really are looking forward to having the chance to exhibit his works in Paris, and we hope reintroduce audiences in France to this great American painter's work. Thank you very, very much. I look forward to continuing the discussion with you all.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your wonderful sharing. Please keep the PowerPoint sharing. 在讲座的过程当中，不少中途进入直播间的书友们呢，一直都在直播间询问是否有回放。在这里，我统一的回复一下，本场讲座有回放，大家关注佳作书局的视频号，点击左上方的白色头像，在简介下方会看到一行蓝色的小字“佳作书局”。点进去呢，就能够找到本次直播的回放，还可以看到近期所有讲座的预约信息。点击预约呢，就可以在直播开始之前收到更多的消息提醒。大家不要忘记点关注，以免错过更多学者为我们带来的精彩的讲座。除了买书对我们最大的支持之外呢，也请大家多多点赞、分享、关注我们的视频号和公众号。提醒各位书友，在对谈环节之后呢，我们还有问答的环节，在这个过程当中，欢迎大家持续的在评论区提出问题。好，现在就进入到对谈的环节，我就将话筒交给郑老师，有请郑老师。
好的，大家可以听到我声音对吧？好的，那我现在来进行下一个环节。首先，我要跟 Stephanie 说一下这个环节。Okay, yes, thank you, Stephanie. That is a very eye-opening presentation. Now we have a deeper understanding of Sargent and his work. 所以呢，我们接下来呢，由我来为大家总结一下讲座的内容。然后呢，我们将会邀请中央美术学院贺宇教授进行分享，并且他会与 Stephanie 进行对谈。So first of all, let me do a brief summary in Chinese, and then I will invite Professor He Yu to offer his thoughts and comments regarding this lecture, and then he will have a conversation with Stephanie. 好的， 我下面来总结一下刚才 Stephanie 的讲座的内容。她刚才为我们介绍了由纽约大都会艺术博物馆和法国奥赛博物馆联合举办的萨金特与巴黎的特展。这个展览呢，探索了从1874年开始，萨金特在法国巴黎10年的辉煌的艺术生涯。他在19世纪末一直非常活跃，所以呢，他的画作《X 夫人》在沙龙展上引起了不小的风波，并且取得了巨大的成功。萨金特在这一时期的作品呢，展现了他成为艺术家的独特历程。在巴黎的经历也是他职业生涯的基础。他是一位世界闻名的肖像画家，同样呢，也画了很多风景作品，并且一直在不断的突破自我，开拓了艺术的边界。他向我们展示了2张萨金特和他的妹妹的合影，以及与母亲的照片。然后呢，萨金特是出生于意大利的佛罗伦萨。他虽然是美国人，但实际上从来没有居住在美国。他一直跟着家人在欧洲各地游历。他的妈妈呢，也是一位业余画家，并且一直鼓励孩子们画画，带领他们参观各地的博物馆。他在14岁的时候前往阿尔卑斯山徒步旅行期间，创作了一本水彩画集，展现了他绘画的天赋以及与肖像画和风景画的兴趣。1874年，18岁的萨金特抵达巴黎。他在巴黎度过了大概10年的时间。他积极地投身于巴黎的艺术界，结合早期的艺术积累，又融入了当时的艺术元素，形成了独具特色的风格。萨金特呢，通过创作大幅面的肖像画，在沙龙里面亮相，不断地突破传统，获得了很多的名誉和奖项，也同样受到了赞助人的青睐。这些作品为我们呈现了19世纪末法国巴黎社会及其艺术界的众生相。该展览一共有10个展厅，我将一一为大家简要介绍。展厅1是在工作室中，萨金特精通意大利语、德语和法语，并且能够流利地使用西班牙语。他的语言天赋呢，使得他从众多艺术家脱颖而出，并且能直接与国际赞助人交流。他师从卡罗勒斯·杜兰，在杜兰的工作室中呢，他的勤学苦练与专注也为后面的成功打下了坚实的基础。他也是杜兰非常突出的学生。在此期间，他花了大量的人物的写生，受到了正统的造型基本功的训练，同时他的笔触也非常的放松，作品呢独具风格。其中舞动的法翁是他17岁时画的素描。在离开佛罗伦萨前往巴黎前呢，他画的这张画可以看到他扎实的基本功。光与影呢体现了光影的研究，同时期他画了很多的造型、色彩的基本训练。其中一张作品是1879年创作的卢森堡花园，这是一幅很有感染力的画作。他其实很少画这个身边的场景，但这幅画是一个特例。他受到了诸如莫奈等印象派画家的影响，所以画面中呢是一对情侣正在漫步在刚刚改造完的卢森堡花园里，而这座花园是巴黎正在经历了普法战争之后的一些复兴的场景。那么这个画面烘托了一种非常平静，然后也很悠闲的氛围，也是当时的城市重新兴起的一个标志。当时呢是有数以万计的人参观巴黎的这个沙龙，所以呢他也在此期间寻找潜在的客户。他在沙龙里面的首秀是画了他家族的友人弗朗西斯瓦茨小姐的肖像。为了吸引人们的注意呢，这幅作品是非常生动的，而且他展示了不凡的基本功，也迅速开启了他的肖像画生涯。展厅2叫做走出工作室。萨金特渴望在旅行中寻找充满诗意的风景，所以呢，他经常在法国周边的乡下还有海滨地区度过了很多个夏天，为后续的展览呢积累作品。其中《大西洋风暴》这幅作品描绘了一艘小船与风暴斗争的场景，受到了古斯塔夫·库尔贝画家这个作品的影响。这个画面是很有张力，也有很多戏剧性。而且我们可以看到另一张跟这个很像的作品，叫《大西洋的日落》，是1876年莫奈的《印象日出》的那个作品的影响。这2张有共同点。那么这些作品呢，证明他除了和导师学习，还会向同时代的其他的艺术家来学习。另一张作品叫《捕鱼前的准备》，叫 Setting Out to Fish， 描绘了坎考法国卡纳勒地区的景象。当时有法国画家很多呢，都是在这个地方写生。这是一个很怀旧的场景，我们可以看到这张画中清晰的光影。他精心安排了整个画面的布局，包括人物的亮部，还有周围环境的光线、水洼里的倒影都在发光，是一张非常有氛围感的画。他也为此呢 画了很多有研究意义的草图，精心描绘了人物的动作、服饰，证明他在创作中做大量的功课。其他的画作呢，诸如屋顶上的卡普里女孩、卡普里楼梯等等作品，都是他对白色调、对光影证明的对光影的研究的证明。而且他还会雇佣当地人去做模特，其中这个女孩叫做 Flora， 这个女孩呢是他雇的一个模特。那么其中另一张作品叫卡普里，在橄榄树林中，同样的模特穿着卡普里的服饰，依靠在橄榄树上，她深深地吸引了巴黎展览的观众。展厅3呢是旅行的魅力，萨金特以巴黎为中心，四处游历，并记录周围的世界。像《Smoke of Ambergris》这样龙涎香的烟雾的作品呢，就是在法国海岸以及意大利、荷兰、西班牙和北非等地寻找题材进行创作的作品之一。这类旅行题材的作品呢，旨在迎合当时人们的审美，同时也能满足萨金特对描绘异域风情的兴趣。这个龙涎香的烟雾呢，是描绘的一个女子，她身披斗篷，正在注视一个燃烧的龙涎香的香炉，也许是一种仪式。她非常注重白色调之间的微妙差异，如人物与光影、建筑、服饰、首饰的关系。这幅画的重点其实并不是东方主义的美学，而是白色调带来的多重感官的享受。在白上画白本身就是一种挑战，同时他也注重画很多的 detail， 就是银香炉的细节，包括它的质感和光泽。那么这个作品呢，展现了他高超的绘画技法，同时呢，他也展示了在沙龙展览之间的这个场景。每个作品呢都是紧密的展出，为了吸引观众，他创作了大量这种白色调的作品。展厅4呢叫迷人的肖像，这个展厅呢基本都是在3年内完成的。比如说这个拉蒙夫人，还有帕耶龙肖像，这些都是他画的这种人物的作品。然后呢，他其实有很多的这个洞察力，还有人脉的关系，而且很会敏锐地观察到模特的这样一个状态。事实上，他是在这个职业生涯中大量的创作肖像作品，比如说这个是两个小孩子这样的一个作品。那么他其中呢，就是帕耶龙家族的这个肖像，画了很多的人物。关于这个孩子的作品呢，他这个主讲人说画了83遍，可见他对这个作品有极其强大的耐心。而且呢，他当时获得了一个奖牌，并且呢，在展览的时候把这个奖牌和画儿一起展出，也证实了他某些方面的一些成功。他还展示了这批作品的这个展示的这么一个场景。其实这张画是非常适合挂在家里的，它与这个家具呢是相得益彰的，所以可以见到当时的肖像画呀是这个家庭装饰的很重要的一个部分。那么 Dr. Pokey at Home 这个波奇医生在家呢，他不只是一个画的医生的一个肖像，更是体现出这个医生背后这样的一个藏家的身份。这张画画的非常的轻松，大胆的红色调，很多的这个戏剧性在里面，把他帅气的外表表现得淋漓尽致。出于对评价的考虑，这个作品呢其实没有在巴黎展出，后面呢他在伦敦展示了这幅作品。下一个展厅呢，叫做巴黎最受瞩目的画家，其中呢，《The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd》是爱德华·达利·博伊特的女儿们。这幅作品呢，构图非常的前卫，也很吸引人。这是萨金特很有代表性的作品，在展厅中，策展人特意给这幅作品留下了一个完整的空间，让观众对这幅作品有一个近距离欣赏的机会，感受它无限的魅力。这幅画的人物的布局非常奇特，对于空间和光影的布局安排巧妙，背景呢是比较昏暗的，而且安排了一面镜子，中间是一个日式的大花瓶，仿佛置身于《爱丽丝梦游仙境》。如果大家了解这个故事，我们可以看到这个女孩和花瓶的对比啊，就像是这个爱丽丝掉进了凸起洞里这样的一个场景。那么高光也是安排的非常细致。那这幅作品显然受到了维拉斯凯兹的作品《宫娥》的影响。那么这幅作品在当年也是非常独特的存在。在画面的布局呢，萨金特有自己独特的一个思考。然后展厅6是友谊与赞助，像这个时期的作品呢，包括了很多女性的一个形象，比如说爱德华·帕耶龙夫人、拉蒙夫人、赤玫瑰的夫人 （Lady with the Rose） 都是在1882年左右画的作品。这一时期的作品呢，它一直在不断的变换笔法，来表达不同女性间独有的魅力，也为它赢得了很多声誉。 展厅7呢是巴黎女郎，我们可以看到她在这个时期，有很多影响她的画家，比如说 Carlos Duran、Leon Bonnat 这样的一个作家，卡罗勒斯·杜兰、莱昂波纳、爱德华·马奈等等人都是她的影响她的导师或者是朋友，所以萨金特敏锐地捕捉到了时髦现代巴黎女性的形象。展厅8呢是 X 夫人，这个 Madame X 是这个萨金特最重要的作品。那么 Stephanie 呢探讨了 X 夫人在这幅画的创作的过程，从其起源到其受到的评价，试图对这幅画引起的 scandal 进行更细致的解释，就是轩然大波进行更细的解释。那么这个萨金特在巴黎赢得了很多的声誉，但这个时候呢也同样带来了很多压力，所以呢他决定画一张更加大胆的作品。于是呢，在1884年，当 Madame X 夫人画像在沙龙展出的时候，引发了不小的争议。有的人就觉得画的特别恐怖，或者是极其大胆。那么 X 夫人在萨金特这个时期呢，她是画的叫高特罗夫人，这个高特罗夫人就是 X 夫人本人。那么她呢是一位法裔的美国人，她早年丧父，后来又嫁给了法国的商人，是当地非常有名的这样的一个名媛。那么萨金特专门找到了高特罗去画像，它并不是一个 commission， 并不是一个委托作品。这两个年轻人呢，其实都渴望得到更多的名声，所以他俩一拍即合来合作这个作品。为了准备它呢，他花了大量的时间去画不同材料的这个高特罗夫人的写生，以及找到找到更好的这个角度来凸显高特罗夫人的个性。在画面中呢，他的这个肩带儿是一个非常特别的存在，因为批评家们不仅质疑这个肩带儿滑落啊，他还是觉得高特罗夫人这个品味是有问题的，并且还质疑她的道德。本身呢，萨金特画的这个第一个版本，这个 Shadow Strap，它是肩带儿是在右肩膀脱落下来的，给人一种肩膀这个连衣裙即将脱落的感觉。那么在《巴黎生活》杂志上刊载了一个讽刺漫画，它赫然写着这个就是你的裙子要掉了。那么高特罗夫人则回应说这是我故意的。那么不过后期呢，萨金特确实把这个肩带改为了正常的这样的一个垂直的方向，只不过呢画得非常的迅速，略显潦草。但通过之前这个沙龙的摄影图片资料，我们依然可以看到它最初的样子。这幅画呢，也是他长期以来的技法的感受的结合的精华，非常有张力。那么《纽约先驱报》呢就说这个高特罗夫人是活生生的艺术品，也有人画了很多comic， 然后画了很多漫画，将这个高特罗夫人比作人类、蛇、美人鱼的结合体，让人想到了这个海妖的形象，像一个 mermaid， 或者很像是这个扑克牌上的这个黑桃。那么这个作品呢，不但给萨金特，也给高特罗夫人带来了很多的困扰。高特罗夫人的妈妈其实也很担忧，希望她撤掉这个作品，但是萨金特没有这么做，并且呢，有意思的是，高特罗似乎也非常享受这个作品带来的一些影响，包括之后呢，高特罗都会穿着这些类似的裙子，出席在各个场合，然后包括我们可以看到后期的作品也是很像这幅画的这个着装。由于这张画不是一个委托作品，所以萨金特一直保留在身边。那么虽然这个 X 夫人给他带来了短暂的阻碍，但是萨金特在19世纪80年代和90年代之后的肖像作品依然很完美。他在59岁时呢，将 X 夫人出售给了Met， 就是纽约大都会艺术博物馆，并且说到这是我画的最好的作品，这也反映了这幅肖像以及巴黎对他重要的影响。展厅9呢是1884年的沙龙，我们可以看到这个 salon 的这样的一个场景，在展厅中呢，策展人特意还原了当年的这个 Paris salon 的一个场景，这样我们就能知道X 夫人是如何从数以万计的作品中脱颖而出的。展厅10叫做奇异的景象，1890年创作的La Carmencita 是卡门西塔，这个是一个跳弗拉明戈舞女郎的这样的一个形象，与这个 X 夫人一样，它也不是一张委托的作品。这幅作品呢被卢森堡博物馆收藏，这种大幅面的肖像画表现的贵气十足，而且这幅作品的人物是自信而生动的，它认真勾勒了模特的裙子的每一处细节。那么这幅作品呢，也是他里程碑式的代表作之一。 最后呢，他画了一个 self portrait，就是30岁画了一个自画像，这是他早期艺术的结晶。这是他那个时期呢，年轻的萨金特决定成为一个职业的画家，并且培养了自己的一个才华和抱负，并且呢，他将那里的所学所获成就了自己的成功之路。后面呢，他继续转向画壁画，成就依然非常辉煌。在 X 夫人展览之后呢，萨金特离开巴黎，前往伦敦。他与莫奈的关系非常好，在 Claude Monet 在1887年，向莫奈坦白，他向莫奈说：“我决定不让自己在巴黎被遗忘。”那么萨金特其实从未真正离开过巴黎，因为他在那里获得的技能、教育还有人际关系，使得他受益终生。目前呢，这个展览已经在纽约结束了，正在前往法国巴黎奥赛博物馆进行展出。OK，那我们简要的先总结到这里。下面有请中央美术学院贺宇教授。贺教授呢，作为国内实践传统写实油画风格的优秀画家代表，对于油画肖像题材有较厚的造诣。那么请贺老师为大家分享他的作品及相关见解，以及对 Stephanie 提出
好的，
相关的问题。好，有请贺老师。
好的，谢谢主持人，谢谢郑老师。我也要感谢我们这次展览萨金特展览的策展人 Stephanie Herdrich 女士，给我们带来一个很精彩的讲座。就是萨金特呢，对于中国油画家来说是一个非常熟悉的，而且也是就是对中国油画界应该说有很大影响的一位美国画家。我个人呢是在上学的时候我就非常喜欢萨金特的作品。这次展览我觉得就是选的这个萨金特早期的在巴黎的这个阶段也是很有意义。就像我们策展人说的，这是他整个艺术生涯的一个起点，是他这个艺术成长的一个应该说早期的非常重要的环节。而且我个人觉得呢，就是说萨金特他在这个19世纪、20世纪之交，在这个油画从就是直接画法开始全面就是走向直接画法，而且再由直接画法，再转向表现性的语言，是吧？因为你看萨金特他的这种笔触，他的这种画面的这种生动性，这是以前19世纪以前的这个作品不太能够见到的。所以萨金特在这个大的历史转变当中呢，应该说他个人的才华，他的这种情感。在这里边和这个绘画发展的这个大的趋势结合的非常的好，也就留下了萨金特他在绘画历史上的这样的一个很崇高、很独到的这样一个地位。我个人的理解是这样的，就是这一次展览，我觉得对于我们中国画家来说呢，我觉得有点遗憾，就是什么时候能够到中国来展出。这几年在北京、上海啊，都有很多优秀的西方画家的展览。你看像列宾在咱们北京的国博的展览，是吧？是一个很全面的。我希望能够有朝一日能够在北京或者上海，中国的大城市，能够看到萨金特的这样的专门的展览。我觉得那样的话，中国的画家、中国的观众都会非常的高兴，非常的感谢我们的大都会的博物馆，还有我们的策展人，就这么多。对，我想问一下，就是我记得就这个展览里边是不是还有一些作品是在巴黎吗？像卡姆西塔那幅画是在奥赛博物馆，然后我看到展厅里面还有那张罗丹的肖像，罗丹的肖像好像是在罗丹的故居。那些画是从巴黎先运到了大都会来参加这个展览吗？对，我先说这么多，谢谢。
好的，贺老师。那 I'll briefly translate what Professor Hus means. He said, Sargent, as a master of oil painting, has always held a very high status in the Chinese oil painting community. So this exhibition offers a valuable opportunity to explore his art and works. Although it is unfortunate that the exhibition could not come to China, he believed that all the Chinese oil painters who appreciate Sargent's art will be very thankful toward Stephanie, the curator of this exhibition. Sargent was able to fully master the Western academic system of fundamental drawing skills. His solid skills and masterful command of painting technique were extremely rare throughout the entirety of the 19th and 20th century. Secondly, Sargent lived during the golden age of the realist painting between the 19th and 20th centuries, establishing a distinctive artistic style among many great artists. Notably, his mastery of the direct painting method stands out. Unlike the previously dominated indirect approach, this technique requires closely integrating form, color, and brushworks in the very few layers, giving Sargent's work a uniquely personal character compared to his contemporaries. Additionally, he noted that many of his representative portraits were actually his creations rather than commissions from upper class or the wealthy patrons. As is generally believed, in this portrait, he devoted himself fully, demonstrating an artist's extreme rigor and pursuit for perfection. So regarding Sargent's artistic achievements, he believed that since the 19th century, from the Barbizon school to Impressionism, and the most notable development was growing integration of with expressive method, so which became the main. This context, Sargent perfectly combined the forms, making it difficult for the later generation to surpass. So he has a question. Since many of the masterpieces of the work came from the France, from the Musée d'Orsay, he noticed that like Camanceta, like the sculpture of Rodin, something like that, is from Paris to the New York City, or just directly sent it from anywhere. Yes, that's his question. Thank you.
Sorry, I think the internet was a little funny. I missed a tiny bit right before the question. It was about, sorry.
He mentioned that all of the masterpieces are from the Musée d'Orsay.
Yeah.
So when did the works came from? Where did these works came from? Is that from the Paris or somewhere else, like Camanceta, something like that?
Exactly.
Thank you.
So, I mean, most of Sargent's work, I would say now, is in the United States or in England, but there are a good number of these early paintings that are made in France still in France. So in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, many of Sargent's friends and patrons actually donated their paintings by Sargent to these museums in Paris, right? So if I'm understanding the question correctly, like Carmencita is actually purchased by the French state, but like the Rodin painting is Sargent paints a portrait of Rodin, gives it to Rodin, and then it ends up at the Rodin Museum. So some of these French works have just been donated to the French museums in the period. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, yes, probably. OK, I'm translated. 所以那个 Stephanie 说，其实当时很多的现在很多作品都是在美国和英国。然后呢，其实当时在19世纪晚期和20世纪早期，很多的作品都是在法国创作的。那么其实在当时呢，有很多的赞助人，他们都将这个作品呢，捐献给了奥赛博物馆。像这个卡门西塔是卢森堡博物馆的藏品，像这个罗丹的这个作品呢，罗丹这个作品呢，它是从罗丹博物馆来的，所以其实有很多都是这个就是赞助人，就是当时的这个赞助人他们自己的一些捐赠，大概是这样。我不知道有没有解释的比较清楚，何宇老师。
好的，谢谢。
好，您可以再提一些问题，我们来进行一些对谈。
就是 我觉得就是我不知道美国的那个艺术史的同行那个怎么看待萨金特他在这个整个西方绘画的这样的一个地位，他的呃一个意义，就是
OK，
嗯。
好的，谢谢。Okay, so the second question from Professor He is, sorry, what inspiration does Sargent offers today for today's arts historians and artists, and how do you feel about the Sargent historical status in the United States or over the world? Thank you.
Well, as he pointed out, Sargent's art is still a tremendous inspiration for painters working today. He mentioned Sargent's direct painting method, his really brilliant technical skills with paint, his powers of observation. He has really become a role model for painters in that way. And we definitely noticed that many visitors to our exhibition were artists, and the artists came again and again to study Sargent's art. But more broadly speaking, in the United States, Sargent has become extremely popular in the last decade. He has been admired for many decades, but there was a time after his death in 1925 for many years that his reputation was not good in the United States. And I think he mentioned a little bit of this, which is, people, his painting technique was so expressive and so brilliant that it was actually sometimes criticized because he made it look too easy and it was too stylish. And then he was criticized for painting portraits of very wealthy people. And I think more recently, we've come to understand um, much more and appreciate Sargent's art. There have been several big exhibitions in the United States and Europe of Sargent's work in the last decade that have made him much more familiar to our audiences and visitors. And I do think that there has been a shift in his reputation to being much more completely accepted, that his painting technique is admired much more now, that the people have begun kind of dismissing the accusation that his art lacked substance. As we learn more about him and study his work more closely, we really see how intentional his art is, how ambitious it is, how thoughtful he is about art history and incorporating art history into his practice and positioning his art. And I think there is a very interesting sense now that it's become easier for people to simply admire the beauty of his art and the skill of his art. That was less common years ago.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Very informative. So I'll just briefly translate. 其实呢，在这个美国在艺术史中对萨金特的看法经历了一些变化。那么其实就像您这个贺老师之前说的那样，他确实是画法非常有表现力，他是用这种直接画法来绘画的，而且他有非常清晰的洞察力。对于模特，在当时他的这个做法其实是属于非常前卫的，而且呢，有很多观众和艺术家都来前往这个大都会艺术博物馆来参观，就是他们很多都是专业的，搞专业的人一遍又一遍的去看这个展览，而且呢，在最近的10年或者说几十年吧，就是对萨金特的这个崇拜和热爱是越来越多的，呈一个上升的这样的一个趋势。但是 比较有趣的是，其实他死后的那一段时间，死后的几十年里面，没有受到过很多的关注，可能就是由于在当时的时候，人们会觉得萨金特的客户啊、委托人都是这种上流社会，就都是比较有钱的人，而且他画的作品就比较风格化，比较行吧，可以这么说。那么他直到最近呢，随着这个艺术史学家越来越多的去研究，人们才开始意识到他作品的一些魅力。于是呢，在最近几十年里，包括过去10年，有很多大型的萨金特展览，在美国、在欧洲都会有这些展览，让观众们更加对他的作品开始有一些熟悉。而且呢，他作品这种表现力是非常强烈的。我们在研究了萨金特之后，才会意识到他当时这种充满雄心勃勃的这种作品，他的野心以及他对那个作品过程的深度思考。所以通过这个研究萨金特，研究他的这个艺术史呢，我们就会知道，他的这个过去的实践是多么令人就是受到启发，人们也开始越来越多的可以欣赏到他作品的美感。大概是这样的。好，何老师，您可以再提一个问题给 Stephanie 老师。
因为我们确实是有同感，就是呃就是萨金特画了很多，就是给 upper class 那个或者是 wealthy people 画的那些定件。但是呢，我们也要看到，就是他很多优秀的代表作，实际上是他自己主动去创作的。像卡米西塔，像 X 夫人，包括还有一些他的一些肖像画。实际上，萨金特他是一个，就是就是一个艺术上，一方面是很精益求精，另外一方面呢，他是对于一个就是在肖像绘画发展到他那个时候，应该往哪个方向去探索、去发展，他是一个有很强的主见的这样的一个艺术家。包括他画 X 夫人的时候还非常年轻，但是呢，已经能够感觉到，就是他对于这个西方肖像画的这样的一个一种就是怎么说呢，创新吧，是吧？他要要和前辈画家要拉开他的差距，不光是一种技法上，而且还有一种画面的一种感觉，对人物的表达。所以我觉得，我觉得，这些对于我们这些今天从事实践的画家，我们也作为中国的油画家，应该说也是很有启发的。我觉得就是说，在今天那个，我想了解一下，就是说，萨金特对于美国的这个美术院校的教学的绘画教学，还有什么样的影响，或者说，今天还有美国的画家，还是沿着这条道路在继续的在进行创作和这个探索，有没有这样的就这个问题？
OK，好的，我翻译一下So, Mr. He think that Sargent always paint for the upper class, for the wealthy patrons. That is the his personal styles, and then he created a lot of the non-commissioned works like Camiseta, like Madame X, and he has his own ambitions to explore more possibility for the portrait paintings. And to be different from others, he did a lot to put many efforts on it. And that is very inspiring for our Chinese oil painters. So his question is, what's the influence for the Sargent works for the United States art schools? And then, is there any artists in modern artists still learn from him? Thank you.
Yes, and he brings up a very good point, and I do think that one of the special qualities of this early period of Sargent's career is that inspiration that during the time in Paris, as Sargent is just getting started out, he isn't only painting rich people and he is doing more non-commissioned portraits. And those are, I think, his most personal works, his most ambitious works. And the he does put a lot of symbolism and thought and ambition into those works. And I do think that makes this period particularly interesting. Yet I think, as I tried to say earlier, that his technical ability is one of the things that artists today admire most about him. In addition to his power of observation and ability to, in his best paintings, convey that intensity and ambition through his subjects. And I think, aside from his technical prowess and skills as an artist, I do think that as a professional working artist, he has also become a role model for artists trying to establish careers in his ability to network with people, to build circles of relationships, friendships, patronage, kind of leverage these relationships to build his career through hard work and skill and charisma and effort. So, as a kind of professional artist, I think, that's quite separate from the making of art. Um, he he was able to succeed partly through his I'm going to say I would say social acumen, his social intelligence, which is another side of his art.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I will translate it. 所以呢，他觉得这个您的这个视角特别的有这个启发性。他也认为萨丁特其实并不全是给上流社会或者是有地位的人来画这个委托作品，他也是一直在有一些雄心勃勃的创作，并且对画作有非常多的思考，创作了一些非常有趣的作品。其实呢，在更早的时期呢，技术一直是大家追求的对象，而且呢，像萨金特这种强烈的观察能力，以及对于绘画主题的主动思考，都是艺术家们学习的对象。像是他的一些不只是技术，绘画的技术，更重要的是他的社交能力，他的友谊的维系，以及与赞助人之间的这种主动的寻求赞助人的这个赞助，都是他成为一个成功艺术家的一个事业的助力。是一些非常好的成为专业画家的一些品行和一些品质，尤其是他对于社交的这样的一个敏锐的洞察力，都是现代的美国艺术家们依然去非常敬佩、非常想要学习的一个对象。对，大概是这样子。好的，那我们今天这个对谈的环节先到这儿。Thank you, Stephanie and Professor He, for this discussion. And I think it's about the time for us to take some questions from our viewers. 所以呢，现在呢，我们把时间留给线上的观众朋友们，让他们来给我们进行下一个环节的问答。我们会在直播间里面选择一些问题向嘉宾老师提出，也非常欢迎大家的参与。因为时间的关系呢，我们只能选择部分的问题来进行回答。所以说，就是希望大家多多理解。好的，那我们看到现在直播間已经有很多的问题，所以我们来选取其中的一部分问题。So our first question from my viewer is in today's environment, is it possible for the young artists to break the conventions like Sargent did with the Madam X, so they will have more opportunities to stand out and be successful to attract people's attention? Sorry, Stephanie, I need to read it in Chinese first. Sorry. 那我忘了说中文了。他的问题是，当今的艺术家们，年轻的艺术家们是否有可能像萨金特这样创作 X 夫人那样打破常规，然后从而获得更多的成功的机会，然后来吸引人们的关注呢？Okay, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Me first, or it's a very interesting question. Yeah, because the art world is so incredibly different today. And I think the Sargent's time had such a different sense of the boundaries and convention, which are so different today. So Sargent was really establishing his awareness of art history and convention and then pushing beyond it. So I think it's a complicated question in the sense of I feel in the United States at least there's so many fewer boundaries around portraiture today than in Sargent's time. Um, and yeah, and I think in the US, um, I do I would say it's possible actually. If I think of some of the great portraitists working in the United States today, and I'm thinking of someone like Amy Sherald, who recently had a show at the Whitney Museum, working in a very, very different style. But she's someone also who acknowledges the conventions of portraiture and the tradition, and then refers to them, but then is doing something very different. But I'm very interested
Okay.
to hear what he has to say too, from a different perspective.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. 好的，这个问题呢，Stephanie 觉得非常的有趣，而且呢，她觉得这个确实是现代艺术家们需要思考的一个问题。其实不同的时代对于传统的定义其实也不太一样。像在当时的这个萨林特确实是做了非常多打破传统的这么一个事情。那么他其实是建立自己的一个主观的一个意识来绘画。他也是结合了自己的所学与艺术史之间的关系来打破传统。那么其实在美国呢，在那一时期有很多的艺术家都希望能够打破这个界限。像这个最近呢，他有一个比较想到了一位艺术家叫做 Amy Sheld，他是在惠特尼美术馆有一个这个展览，在这个展览作品中呢，他也是画的肖像画，同样是画了很多的这个介于传统之间的这样一个作品，但同时呢，他又从传统中汲取养分，然后创作出了一些非常当代的、非常现代的一些作品。Okay, thank you. So I will choose another question. 第二个问题是，从展览中的照片可见，他的画室中布满了各种的亚洲的艺术品，中国风、日本风，对于萨金特的艺术有影响吗？Okay, our next question is, as seen in the exhibition photos, his studio was filled with Asian artworks. Did like the Japanese actually influence the Sargent's art, like Asian styles? Thank you.
Yeah, I do. Yes, I think he was very aware of all kinds of artistic tradition. And of course, there is a popularity of Asian art in Paris during this time, especially Japanese prints, which was something he was very interested in. It also informed the works of the Impressionists. So we do see some of those objects and artifacts in the studio. We can see some evidence in his work of art, kind of filtered through works of other contemporary painters. It's not something that he ever wrote about or spoke about. So I'm just more generally, we know that he was very, very interested in art history and art from across cultures and across different areas.
Okay. Thank you, thank you so much. 是的，他觉得这个问题其实也非常有意义，因为他觉得萨金特其实一直在不同的这个领域中汲取养分，包括学习亚洲艺术，尤其是对于日本艺术，他是非常感兴趣的。而且呢，他认为这个艺术家们，去学习一些不同领域、去跨界去学习艺术史也是非常必要的。所以说，萨金特其实也是一直的，他的注意力就是在寻找不同的这个作品当中，做不同的这个领域、不同的传统之间，包括异域风情，他其实对异域风情情有独钟。像那个龙形巷的烟雾就是一个充满东方主义艺术的这么一个作品。Okay, so okay, I will choose a last question. So the last but not least, OK，萨金特的创作对于现代绘画有没有影响？Did Sargent work influence modern art, modern painting? Yes, that's our last question.
You mean, does his work influence other arts? Was that the question?
Modern contemporary, like modern paintings. Yeah.
I mean, I do see, I mean, connections to definitely to graphic arts, to artists that work in very expressive styles. I think stylistically, that is probably Sargent's greatest influence and reach across different mediums and genres.
OK, thank you. 所以他其实觉得这个现代艺术的定义比较广泛，包括一些比较平面的艺术，而且艺术家的风格也很多变。那么现代艺术家会用更多的媒介，或者是这个不同的派系、不同流派去创作，所以其实它是有影响的。但是现代艺术的定义其实更加的广泛。好的。I guess that's all the Q&A today. So thank you so much for answering the question and providing us the additional insights. Many thanks to Professor He for the furthering our understanding. 好，那么今天的问答环节就告一段落了。
嗯。